Zoku's webinar series, Innovation at Scale. My name is Lisa Jackaman, and today I am joined by my colleague, Andreana Benhoff. We are Senior Innovation Consultants here at Zoku, and today we plan to share a little around how we plan a challenge. This is the second in a series of webinars on the topic of challenge planning, which is an approach or methodology that can be applied to internal challenges, but also for co-creation external challenges. First, I would like to thank you all for joining the session today and invite you to add questions to the chat, and we will answer either during or at the end of our presentation. Before we get into the topic of challenge planning part 2, I would like to tell you a little bit more about how you can use Zoku and how we can help organizations innovate with general and external communities and audiences. At Zoku, we work with organizations to embed ways of working and processes for innovating at scale, providing a way to crowdsource ideas, suggestions, problems, and solutions from different audiences, be those within the organization, known to the organization, or to a fully open crowd. Slide. We do this by using a methodology called challenge-driven innovation. Rather than just asking anyone for an idea, we focus on breaking down important goals and opportunities into specific challenges and invite the crowd to contribute either through sharing their ideas, commenting and collaborating, developing the ideas, voting or ranking and evaluating the ideas. As well as providing the platform to capture, refine, evaluate, and select ideas, we want our organizations to have visibility into the metrics and health of their challenges and communities. It is through these insights, they can work to improve their approach over time, aiming to provide that end-to-end capability and repeatable process and value capture for their organization by crowdsourcing ideas from anyone, anywhere, at any time. So if we take a look at challenge-driven innovation, here we have the challenge-driven innovation mapped out for ease. If you take a project, a program, or area of the business that could be around just sustainability or cost reduction, new products, or customer experience, and then break it down into specific problems, needs, or challenges where we can leverage crowdsourcing to identify actionable solutions or ideas. This enables organizations to make qualified decisions around types of challenges being run and makes it easier to get ideas through to conclusion because those ideas are in scope, they have a business owner, are implementable, and add value and or benefits. B. Schofield, our Director of Customer Success, ran a webinar around exploring the different challenges you can run on Zoku, and that may be of interest to some of you today. So once organizations have determined the pipeline of challenges, the next area is to select the channels. Who is the right audience to select these problems? It might be your internal employees, it might be those outside your organization, or in fact, it might be both. We know crowd diversity is an important element to creating those serendipitous and innovative ideas. Once the crowd has been identified, the challenge planned, which is where we're focusing today, and the challenge launched, the ideas or solutions are evaluated and selected before going into the organization for further development and execution. As a process, this is a great way to fill your innovation pipeline with ideas and solutions which address real business problems and provide solutions. So today, we focus on the second part of the challenge planning around defined challenges. Andreana will share with you our example scenario to keep in mind as we continue through the approach. Over to you, Andreana.
All right, thanks so much, Lisa. So as Lisa mentioned, there are 3 key phases to planning a challenge. The first of which is what we dove into in our previous webinar. If you haven't had a chance to watch it, we do have it available on our site. And this really focused in on a few key areas. First of which is to identify who is the sponsor with the problem or opportunity, what does success look like, and our target audience for who we feel can help solve that initiative. The second part in this is thinking around the challenge metrics. What are our goals at the end of the challenge that we can sit back and look and say, yes, we were able to achieve everything we tried to do. And then the second part of the challenge framing is to dive into the process. When we're thinking about the process, we're thinking about the user experience at the beginning. So having folks come in, submit their ideas, other activities they can do throughout the process, and then thinking through to help validate which ideas we want to move forward with. So what is the evaluation process that we're going to go through as we run this challenge? The last key area is around the challenge communications. When we're thinking about the communications, we're thinking about what channels we want to utilize as part of the challenge. how often we want to communicate, and what those communications should include. So stay tuned for an upcoming webinar where we'll dive into challenge part 3, but today we're going to focus in on the challenge framing. So if you all recall from our last webinar, and as Lisa mentioned, we do have a sample scenario here as we're going through this process. So in this scenario, we have the VP of Customer Experience who needs to improve customer satisfaction. Over the recent years, their NPS score has been going down, and she now has a goal to figure out how to get their NPS score higher within the next 12 months. This is tied to her KPIs, her bonus, and the company strategy as a whole. So clearly there is that strategic alignment and that need to get this solved. As we go through today, we're really going to focus in on these 5 key areas for the challenge planning process. First of which is the challenge metrics, which is what does success look like for this challenge? The second is what is it that we're asking for our audience to come in and include as part of their idea? So what are they submitting in regards to the idea itself? What are the details there? The third area is how do we want to include voting as part of this process? And do we want to include voting as part of it? From there, we'll dive into the idea selection process. So thinking through and vetting out those top ideas to determine which ones we want to move forward with taking action at the close of the challenge. And then lastly, the idea implementation and value tracking after we close out the challenge. So really making sure we are moving forward with the ideas that have been selected and tracking value that's coming out of it. So with that being said, we'll first dive into the challenge metrics. So if you recall, one of the things we would have identified in the first challenge planning process is who our audience is. As part of that, we want to be able to identify how many people are we reaching out to as part of the audience. Is it 1,000 folks? Is it 10,000 folks? Is it 50,000 people, right? How large is our audience? And then once we have that estimated number defined, we can then go in and put in some engagement metrics and figure out what do we want to see in terms of participation. The next area is how many ideas do we want to take forward at the close of the challenge? This can really be changed depending on the type of challenge that you're running. So if you're looking to run a challenge that's more disruptive, you may only take one idea into action at the close of it, because resources, timing, budgets are really going to be a lot different when you're thinking disruptive innovation versus incremental. Incremental, you might have that kind of low-hanging fruit, quick hit ideas that you can easily move forward with, where you might be able to take closer to 5 or 10 ideas forward. But having that initial number in mind will help as you're going through the evaluation process. The last thing we want to consider is what types of benefits are we going to get as a result of this challenge? When we're thinking benefits, we're thinking through cost savings, revenue generation. So really think through and identify what are the ultimate benefits that we want to see once we close this out. We do have some recommended metrics here as a starting point. One thing that you will find is as your program evolves and matures, you might end up kind of sorting through and saying, okay, this is actually what success looks like. But this is kind of on average what we would recommend across our client base. So to start off here on the left, we're thinking through our program engagement. When we're thinking about engagement, it's who are we going to get to come into the site and what activities are they going to do? So of those that we invite to a challenge, we typically see about 50% of our audience log into the site. Of those, about 50% of the folks that come into the site will go through, maybe they'll click and read through some ideas, read the overview, look to get kind of an understanding of what this is all about, but they may not contribute. And that's okay. They're at least coming into the site and checking it out, and they're more likely to contribute in the following challenges. The second group that we look at is the contributors. So we typically see about 40% of those that access the site come in and do some kind of activity, whether that be post an idea, comment on ideas, or vote on ideas. They're doing some kind of activity. Lastly, we see about 10% of our audience that comes into the site come in and submit an idea or a solution and contribute in that way. So again, this is based off of our experience, what we've seen. You may be a client that has, a well-established program where you're seeing higher numbers, or maybe in some cases, depending on your culture, your numbers might be a little lower, and that's okay as long as you're getting those good quality ideas at the close of the challenge. The second area that we want to think through is how many ideas do we want to get at the close of the challenge? In our scenario here that we're thinking through, we typically recommend going through kind of a two-stage evaluation process. The first of which is where we're using the system to do the initial filter of the ideas based off of things like cost, feasibility, ease of implementation, whatever those important success factors are when looking for that good quality idea at the close of the challenge. After we do that initial evaluation, we typically reach back out to those top 5 to 10 idea owners and say, okay, we've established you, we've narrowed it down, we've identified these top ideas. Now go back, take a moment and further refine your idea based off of the collaboration and any other feedback that you've received. From there, maybe there's some kind of pitching session where they have the opportunity to present their ideas. And then it's really a matter of validating, okay, how many do we want to move forward with at the close? Again, 1 to 3 is typically what we see. However, depending on what type of challenge you are running, it could be closer to 10 or maybe on the lower side of 1. The last area that we want to think through when we're setting up our metrics would be the value that we're creating as a result of this challenge. Is it time savings? Is it revenue generation, process improvements, new products or services, even industry or cultural changes? When we're thinking industry changes, I think a good example of this would be the banking industry. Back several years ago, you used to have to go into a bank, work with a teller for any kind of transaction you needed to do. Then it shifted over to the ATM where you could withdraw money anytime or even deposit checks as needed. Now we have contactless payments where we can do everything right on our phone. So really think through and say, okay, what is the ultimate value we're trying to get as a result of this challenge? And if you have a target, as you're implementing these ideas, make sure you're tracking the value you're seeing to see if you're able to hit that target. So for example, if you're thinking about doing a revenue generation challenge and you have a goal of needing to increase revenue by $10 million, be tracking those ideas as they're coming through. Do an initial estimate to say, I think the value of this particular idea is going to be $1 million. And then as it's being implemented, and you might be modifying it as needed. And then once the idea is fully implemented, do the actual value there. Okay, so next area that I wanted to dive into here is thinking through what information do we need to capture from the crowd as they're submitting their ideas. So we want to think through what information do we need for the subject matter experts and other challenge key stakeholders be able to go in and properly assess the ideas. So we do have a sample here that I'll dive into in a minute, but really it's coming up with that kind of middle ground of making sure we have enough information, but not making it too time consuming for our audience. If the form is too long, they're going to be discouraged, say, I don't have enough time, and they won't actually participate. So what is enough information to be able to identify, is this a good quality idea or not? Second is, do we want to have individual members be contributing ideas, or do we want to enable team member functionality as well? Team member functionality allows people to build ideas out together. So maybe I sat with some colleagues, came up with an idea, wanted to submit it in the system. I can include my colleagues that came up with the idea with me. Where this can really come in handy, I think there's a few good scenarios here where I've seen team members use great. One of which is I do have a client that has run a lot of hackathons in the past. And what they do is leading up to the hackathon, rather than just having everybody in a certain location gather in a room and do the hackathon, they use the site ahead of time to capture ideas, build out the teams, and then they actually do an initial evaluation to determine, okay, which are the ideas that we really want to bring to the actual event. So as soon as they get to that event, they're ready to hit the ground running. They have their team and they have their initial idea already thought out. I have another client that's doing this as well, where they have a series of workshops and they've already formed teams as they're doing these workshops, and they're going in and submitting their ideas together as a team. The last thing we want to consider is possibly using a canvas in the system as part of that submission form. So canvases allow teams to be able to go in and visually collaborate on ideas as they're building them out. We do have 3 different types of canvases in the system that you could utilize. First of which is the business model canvas. Second is the lean canvas. And thirdly, we have a SWOT analysis. So something to consider if you want to be able to further develop those ideas as part of this process. In terms of what we would recommend for a submission form, think of this as really kind of the 80-20 rule, where we're probably about 80% there, but depending on the type of challenge that you want to run, this submission form could vary slightly. Every idea is going to require a title, so that's always going to be in the system. And then we do have something called categories. Categories allow you to further bucket the ideas into certain themes. So in our sample scenario here, we have improving customer experience. Well, maybe we want to kind of break it down in the customer journey and determine what part of the journey does this idea touch. Is it onboarding? Is it training? Is it the renewal process? So if I was a user, I could go in and share my idea and say it falls under the training area. We could make sure our subject matter experts get all of the ideas related to training that they can go in and properly evaluate. So it's really making sure, I think there's really a few key benefits here. One is being able to further identify what key themes are coming out of this challenge, but also making sure you have the subject matter experts aligned with the right ideas. We also typically recommend having 2 open fields, one of which is a description of the idea in full detail, and the second would be the benefits of that solution if we were to move forward with implementing it. Now, again, depending on the topic, you might want to include, are there any risks we should be aware of? What about time for implementation? Anything else that might be of relevance for that specific challenge, but again, making sure it's not too time consuming for the users or for the audience. And you can include things like drop down, single select, multi-select. You can even include images. We do have a client, the Royal Air Force, who was running a challenge where they needed to include pictures of engines. So they would simply go in, take a picture of the engine, upload it into the submission form, and be ready to move on. Okay, the third area here that we want to dive into is around the crowd voting. So I think first off, you're going to want to think through and say, do we even want to enable voting from the crowd? It does provide some really great insights if you do want to move forward with it for the challenge stakeholders. So we typically do recommend having this feature enabled, but there may be a scenario where it doesn't make sense, and that's okay as well. So the first question to ask yourself is, do we even want to enable the voting? If so, what role do we want the voting to play as part of our evaluation process? So we do have the ability to have the crowd help filter out some of those top ideas for us. So for example, I have a client that does an enterprise challenge yearly. They have over 50,000 employees that they reach out to, resulting in thousands of ideas. They do have quite a few subject matter experts in place to do the evaluations of the ideas, but they don't have time to go through and evaluate thousands of ideas. So they use the crowd to do that initial filter for them. And basically they say, okay, any idea that receives X amount of votes, maybe it's 10 votes and maybe even a couple comments from the crowd would then go into that evaluation process. So having them help filter out those ideas can help alleviate the process on the back end if you're getting quite abundance of ideas into the system. So something to consider. You may not want to have it be part of the workflow, but you still want the insight from the crowd, and that's an excellent option as well. And lastly, we want to consider what type of voting do we want to utilize. There's 3 different types of voting that we can use in the system. The first of which is your standard thumbs up, thumbs down. So I like an idea or I don't like an idea. The second option is star rating. So think of this similar to Yelp or Amazon or something on those lines, where you can say, I absolutely love this idea and give it 5 stars. I completely dislike it, give it 1, or somewhere in between. The last voting option that we have is token voting. How this works is we could set up the system to say everybody that comes into this challenge has 10 tokens or 20 tokens, whatever the number is we decide, and they get to disperse their tokens however they would like. So if I'm in as a participant and there's one idea that really jumps out at me that says, I love this idea, I think this is the one we should move forward with, I have the ability to put all of my tokens and get behind that specific idea. Or maybe I disperse them. Maybe there's 3 ideas I really like. I can go in and divvy up my tokens however I want. We typically recommend using the star rating as our main option when it comes to voting. What we find is if you're doing the thumbs up, thumbs down, employees don't like to be mean to each other. If you're reaching out internally to employees or even externally with partners, nobody wants to be mean. And so rather than voting down, they won't vote at all. So being able to do that star rating gives folks a little bit more opportunity to be honest. So maybe I like the idea, but I don't love it. So I can give it 3 stars or 2 stars or 4 stars or somewhere in between. It also helps with the stakeholders at the close of the challenge for them to be able to get a better understanding on the sentiment of the crowd. So just something to consider when you're thinking through which voting options you want to utilize. So with that being said, I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to Lisa to talk about idea selection.
Thanks, Andreana. Okay, so our VP of Customer Experience has already defined the goals and success criteria for her challenge. The idea submission form and how the crowd will be leveraged to gather and rank the ideas has also been decided. So the voting on ideas offers a peer-to-peer contribution, as Andreana said, a sentiment check from the crowd, and should you choose to do so, could inform your evaluators as to the priority of ideas for evaluation. Now's a good time to also think about any other expectations from the crowd that need to be considered or addressed. For example, is there enough information and is the purpose and goal of the challenge clear? Additionally, the criteria should be available for your participants. So let's take a look at idea selection. So if we start with the evaluation criteria, and just a side note, Bea and Mariana have done a great webinar around evaluating ideas, and you can catch the recording on our events page. So in thinking about evaluation criteria, I like to review the goals and success metrics for the challenge. In this instance, our VP is looking to increase the Net Promoter Score over the next 12 months and is ideally looking for 1 to 3 main ideas to achieve this goal. Consider what criteria will provide informed feedback from your evaluators and a go or no-go decision. Excuse me. There are some general criteria that I often see and also some alternatives. For more technical challenges, we may also see criteria which is more specific to the topic. So if we look at some of the generalized criteria, we see that quite often we'll see time to implementation, cost to the business, feasibility of the idea, whether or not it's strategically aligned, and also the priority of implementation. Some of the other criteria I also see clients using is around new innovation. Is this something new to the business? Are we looking at potentially one of those breakthrough ideas which changes the industry? Or is it something which already exists? Are we able to scale the idea? Is it aligned to the business? Is it something which is repeatable so we can move it into other areas of the business? Is it sticky? And does it have potential value? So these are all good criteria, different criteria, and it really depends on the type of challenge that you're using to really include what you want from here as an example. So let's take a look at the evaluators. Who needs to be completing these evaluations? Some initial consideration around their knowledge, their expertise and familiarity with the topic. Are they aligned with the business strategy and needs? Do they need to be briefed? In most cases, they absolutely do. Collectively, will they provide similar approaches to ranking? Do they understand the boundaries and purpose of each criteria and are consistent in their scoring? It's important also, especially if your evaluators are communicating with participants, that they can be generous with their feedback, considerate and respectful and concise. This is really important. If they're giving feedback to idea creators around the viability of an idea or coming up with suggestions around how it could be improved or further developed, you want them not to sort of provide a book around it. You would like them to be concise. But equally, if they're providing perhaps not as positive feedback back to the idea creator, they need to be mindful of what they're saying there and be really positive, because we want those people to engage again. They've come up with an idea. Who knows what other ideas they might have down the road. So let's move on to idea selection. There are a variety of ways idea selection can happen. It may be within the Wazoku platform in a committee or board meeting, or even showcase the ideas through the popular Dragon's Den or Shark Tank events. Whichever approach you choose for your selection process, ensure you have the right people involved. Your sponsor, ideally, who is ultimately responsible for taking the ideas forward to implementation. You may also choose to include some key thought leaders, subject matter experts, or any other areas of the business who will benefit or be impacted by the ideas. Consider carefully who should contribute to the selection decision, and that the criteria applied provides an informed go or no-go decision. Of course, if you are able to identify those quick wins through the process, these can be a really great way to encourage visibility of the challenge and demonstrate sponsor commitment to take those ideas forward. So just a quick note on the event approach. We've seen these in many formats, everything from the full stage and panel of executives through to the virtual panel and idea creators in a separate room by video. Whichever approach you select, please do ensure that your idea creators are equipped with the skills to confidently present and convey their ideas. This experience in itself, this presentation experience, can be really valued by the individuals involved. And some of the benefits from sort of these events type selection processes can include visibility of the program, recognition, skills building, increased engagement on future challenges, which is really important, alignment of the business vision, and focus and shared celebrations of business and individual successes, all of which is good stuff. We encourage this part of the challenge planning also to be completed ahead of the launch, so it can be included in communications. And if an event is being planned, then there is sufficient lead and preparation time that your crowd's informed, they understand the criteria for their ideas, and they have really clear expectations. I think generally speaking, transparency of the challenge goals, evaluation criteria, and process is always really key. So if we move forward into post-selection. Now, we should know who will take the ideas forward to implementation, but it can be worthwhile checking this in case anything has changed, especially if there have been recent changes within the business. Once you have the selected ideas, it is important to track them through development and capture the value and benefits post-implementation. You can do this through the Wazoku platform, and there are some options, either, for example, on a challenge-by-challenge basis, so the tracking is actually built into the challenge process, or you could create a new redefined challenge where you track all ideas across all challenges within a separate flow. In both instances, there are some considerations, and we can certainly discuss these with you. There's also the metrics, the analytics that you can leverage too. Tracking an idea not only means that you identify improvements through your development process, but it also provides the opportunity to communicate regularly, providing status updates to your leadership and also engaging with your participants. Most importantly, by capturing the value and benefits, you demonstrate the importance of having an end-to-end capability and repeatable process for crowdsourcing solutions to solve business problems anywhere at any time. What happens next will be in part determined by the type of challenge you are running, internal, co-creation, external. It might be time-boxed, or it might be always on. In all cases, capturing the metrics and reflecting regularly on the success criteria will reveal any gaps and opportunities for improvement. You may also identify potential themes or topics for future challenges. Wrapping up with stakeholders and your participants also brings a close to the challenge, an opportunity to set out the next steps. Remember in your wrap up to recognize not just the selected idea created, but also those key contributors from your participants. And I think also your evaluators deserve at least a thank you for their time. Share the success stories, reward the behavior, celebrate the positive impact of crowd insights. So moving forward, we're looking at 5 key takeaways. Andreana, do you want to start off?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Lisa. So the first key takeaway that we want to make sure everybody thinks through is really making sure you're establishing your goals and success metrics ahead of the challenge before you launch. What this does is this allows you to modify as needed while you're going through the challenge process. So for example, if you set your participation goals in terms of your active users at a certain level and you're not seeing that, you have the ability to adjust as needed going through the challenge. So maybe you need to add in an additional communication. Maybe you need to think about having some kind of spot reward to have folks to kind of really encourage folks to come into the site. So having those set up ahead of time allows you to monitor and modify as needed as you're going through the challenge. The second thing to think through is around the submission form. Make sure your forms are succinct so that you can go ahead and do the proper evaluation without taking too much time from the user experience, right? Folks are very busy, so making sure the forms are short enough that they have the time to go in and submit is crucial, but also making sure you have the appropriate amount of information to be able to properly assess the ideas is equally as important. The third area is just really thinking through what type of voting you want to utilize, but I do encourage you to use it, right? I do think it provides insight on the crowd preferences when you're going through and doing those final evaluations of those ideas. For instance, you might see a challenge sponsor narrow down to the top 3 ideas, but one of those ideas is pretty low voted from the crowd. It may take them a step back and think, why? What are we missing here? I think in our example, we're talking through the customer experience. If we're reaching out to our employees that talk to customers on a regular basis and they're scoring an idea as low as a 2 or 3, maybe there's something we're missing here, right? So it really does give you quite a bit of insight to be able to further investigate and make sure you are targeting the right ideas for action. And with that, Lisa, I'll hand it over to you for the last 2.
Thanks, Andreana. So item 4, idea selection. Just ensure your criteria is very much aligned with your sponsor goals and their constraints. It provides a go or no-go decision, and you have the right evaluators, and they are aligned and understand the criteria also. Number 5, post-selection. Recognize, reward, track the ideas, capture the value, celebrate success, and continue the journey. This is where we leave our presentation for today. Just while we wait to see if there are any questions, Andreana, what are some of the pitfalls that you see with idea submission forms?
Great question, Lisa. And I think, I think I've mentioned a few times now that you really need to make sure the form is not too long, right? So that you can get the proper engagement from your audience. But I think one of the other key things that I didn't really touch on, but is probably equally important, is making sure your audience can answer the questions you have in your form. I've seen a lot of times where they might want to include things like, well, share the cost if this were to be implemented, or the time to implement, or things like that a lot of times the audience just doesn't know, right? I think that's really more where the subject matter experts can come into place as part of the evaluation to give a better sense on what the cost actually is. So really make sure you're thinking through to say, what is it that the audience can answer when giving their submission? The other thing to think through is what fields might be a good to have, but not a required. And you could actually look into doing it more as optional versus a required field. So really think through and make sure you're comfortable and the audience is comfortable with all of the questions that you're asking.
Fantastic. Thank you.
Yeah, and Lisa, I actually had one for you as well. You did mention about doing pitch events as part of that final selection process. Can you share a time when you saw a pitch go really well?
Actually, both the scenarios I mentioned, I've seen do really well. The first one was in relation to a financial institution, and that was where they had a large event. It was an annual event. They had an overall theme of challenges that they were running underneath a particular theme for a business area. And they had this annual event, and they really worked hard to prepare their idea creators and associated teams to prepare to pitch to a panel of executives or of leaders. And it was done in front of their colleagues and peers in an auditorium. And it had such a great vibe to it, because not only were people pitching something that was really important to them, but they learned the skills along the way. They got visibility to the leadership and their peers. And the leaders were also able to engage one-to-one with them. So that was a really fantastic experience for everybody. The other version was with a totally different type of company in a different industry. And actually it was pre-COVID, so there was no need from a COVID perspective of having video. What they did find was that while the panel of leadership were all in the same room to evaluate the ideas or to have the selection process, the actual idea creators were located globally. They were in all kinds of countries and regions. And rather than try and figure out the logistics of getting everybody to the one place, they decided to do it by video. So they then had the technical elements of making sure they had the rooms available. And again, they really worked hard to ensure that their idea creators were prepared and able to appropriately and sufficiently communicate their ideas and get the message across. There was one instance where one of the idea creators just wasn't comfortable, and the champion stood in on their behalf. They were in the room at the time, so they were on video and they were in the room. And as they kind of got further into the pitch, they warmed up and were able to contribute more. But they were just that level of nervousness where they just weren't ready to do it on their own. So they had that additional support. And they're the two scenarios which I've just heard so many good things about.
Excellent. Yeah, and I will mention, I did have a client once that I thought this was really fun. They did a Shark Tank event in an aquarium. So, really thinking about getting creative and having a lot of fun with it can go a long way as well.
Absolutely. Well, Andreana, I'm not seeing any questions at the moment. So in view of time, I think we shall leave it here. Thank you so much, everyone, for your time today. If you've got any further questions, please do not hesitate to reach out to us. And I hope you have a great rest of the week. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thanks so much. Bye.